how long it takes you to come down after a meal. So if you're dealing with someone who's pretty insulin sensitive, even if they eat a big high carb meal, like for me, it would be like a huge handful of grapes. Those are just like, they crush me. It's just wild. It might go up really far, but it should come down really fast, because that's a sign that your cells are hearing that insulin signal, pulling it out of the bloodstream, and that's all working properly. But you can imagine if someone's kind of moving down that spectrum of metabolic problems and they're a little bit insulin resistant, they're not going to clear that glucose as fast.
All right, hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Anthony Chaffee, host of the Plant-Free MD. Thank you for coming for another episode. Today, I have a very special guest, Dr. Casey Means, who's a Stanford-trained doctor and who has recently made a switch, or not, maybe not so recently, from a surgical career into the realm of metabolic health, and started the company Levels. And if you head over to levels.link/plantfreemd giveaway, you can enter to win a Levels annual membership plus a 1-month CGM kit. The giveaway will be open for 1 week from the date of this episode release, and that's around a $400 value. So do check that out. I've got mine, and looking forward to trying that out. Dr. Means, thank you so much for coming on.
So thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So for people who haven't come across you and your work, can you tell us a bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Casey Means. I am a medical doctor. I trained as a ear, nose, and throat, head and neck surgeon before making a big pivot into the world of metabolic health. And, I had done 4 years of medical school at Stanford, almost completed 5 years of my surgical training. And I was just about to finish my residency and sort of take a faculty position as a surgeon. And I really had, I would say like a pretty profound wake up call, kind of looking around me and the American population and what's happening in healthcare today. And just realizing that, the real elephant in the room of American healthcare today, really global healthcare today, is that we're dealing with a metabolic disease epidemic. And, right around this time, there was research coming out at that time that 88% of American adults had metabolic dysfunction. Now it's up to 93.2% of American adults have at least one biomarker of metabolic dysfunction. And so being a surgical super subspecialist, focusing on a very focused part of the body, it really just felt like, even though there's a lot of value to that specialty into the surgeries that these amazing physicians are doing, but there's a much bigger problem at play right now that our system is not doing a great job of approaching or fixing. In fact, it's getting worse every single year, and that's the metabolic disease epidemic. And as you know, that's almost entirely preventable. It's cropped up really in the last 50 to 75 years. It's rooted in our diet and lifestyle and the exposures that our bodies are facing in this modern industrialized world, which is crushing our metabolic machinery, our mitochondrial function, our cellular function. And what's showing up is just a huge spectrum of metabolic associated diseases in all parts of the body that all look very different because they're happening in different organ systems and different cell types. But when you zoom in and actually look at what's happening on the inside of the cell, what's really happening across all those different cells is the same. It's a problem with how our cells make energy, how they metabolize food to cellular energy. And what you end up having when you have metabolic dysfunction is cells that are underpowered, and underpowered cells are going to result in symptoms and disease. And so that's in the brain. It can look like Alzheimer's, dementia. If it's in the vascular system, it can look like hypertension or heart blockages, erectile dysfunction, retinopathy, chronic kidney disease. If it's in the ovaries, it can look like polycystic ovarian syndrome. If it's in the liver, it can look like fatty liver disease. If it's in the joints, it can look like arthritis. And so I stepped away from the surgical field and really devoted my time, my energy, my brain power to how are we going to solve the metabolic disease epidemic in America, which is underlying 9 of the 10 leading causes of death that are torturing American lives. And so that's what I've been doing about the past 4 to 5 years. And part of that mission was starting a consumer health company, co-founding it with my amazing co-founders, which is called Levels, like you mentioned in the intro. And the purpose of Levels is to empower people to understand their own metabolic health. And you're walking around with this monumental issue in our country, and yet the average person has no idea what their metabolic health is, even though it's metabolic dysfunction is the thing that's probably going to kill them. And so we are really, we exist to change that paradigm, to empower people with their own personal health data. So they really know and are owners of this critical part of health. And there's a lot of different ways to understand your metabolic health, but one really important way is tracking your blood sugar levels. It's one of many key metabolic biomarkers, but it's actually the only one we can measure in real time right now. So you can actually put a sensor on your body, a continuous glucose monitor, and see 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, what's happening with your blood sugar and how every bite you take and exercise workout you do, and other various lifestyle choices you make, how that's actually affecting this key metabolic biomarker. And we know that when blood sugar levels get out of control and start being dysregulated and erratic and having sharp peaks and valleys, we know that's associated with metabolic dysfunction. It's a sign that our cells are not doing a good job of converting food to energy properly, so that glucose is building up in the system. And you can see that on a continuous glucose monitor. So Levels enables access to this technology to anyone who wants to optimize their diet and lifestyle, understand their metabolic health. We pair it with software that helps people interpret the data. We give access to metabolic blood work that people can actually get in a lab to see a more broad array of biomarkers, and then a huge educational ecosystem to educate the average person on the science of metabolism, which I think every person now in the Western world really needs to know in order to live the healthiest life. So that's a little bit about my journey.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's great. Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right, thanks guys. And I completely agree. I mean, the vast majority of diseases we treat now are these so-called chronic diseases, and they are just getting worse. So this isn't really a disease. It's not like there's a plague or a rash of infection that's getting out of hand. Something we're doing in our environment is damaging us, and we're neglecting that. And we're seeing the results of that. People are getting less and less well, and having to rely on more and more medications, which are just Band-Aids. They're not actually addressing the underlying cause. And so I really like that idea of empowering people and giving them back the control in their lives to be healthy and not have to be reliant on the medical system as well. I mean, as I'm sure I was quite disillusioned by the fact that you can go into like a subspecialty and do some really amazing, really interesting things, but you're realizing that what you're doing is just sort of damage control, and you're sort of picking up the pieces, and there's traumas and there's different sorts of things that they're like, well, this is just an acute emergency and that's what we're here for. But a lot of these things, you're just sort of picking up the pieces of lifestyle and environmental hazards that have just sort of built up over time. And I mean, I had a professor once who decided not to go into vascular because he just said, all I'm doing is I'm spending 16 hours fixing his vasculature, and then people just going and smoking and drinking and just destroying all the work that I did. What the hell's the point of that? And so, so it's just sort of, it almost feels quite defeating, when you run up against that.
Absolutely. And I think, ENT was such an interesting field because I didn't realize this until the very end, but I was essentially just an inflammation doctor, and I didn't really realize it, as you know, but maybe some of the listeners don't, like the suffix in medicine, itis, it's the suffix that means inflammation. And I was looking at sort of what I was doing day in and day out, and it was laryngitis, sinusitis, otitis, mastoiditis, parotitis, cellulitis, uveitis. I mean, it's so much. Tracheitis. I could just go literally on and on. And so really what was in our arsenal in terms of impacting those conditions was just a whole bucket of steroids. It was the oral steroids, the inhaled steroids, the nasal steroids, the topical steroids. And steroids, of course, are a medication that suppresses the immune response. And so much of the surgeries that we do, if those medications don't work, is we essentially go in and bust holes in things to suck out inflammatory like pus. So if you think about what are ear tubes, which is one of the surgeries we did all the time, you're cutting a hole in the eardrum and sucking pus out of the middle ear. Sinusitis surgery, blow a hole in the sinus, literally drill a hole in the sinus bone sometimes and let pus drain. And, if you've got, if you've got a big abscess in the neck, you make a hole in the cellulitis skin and the pus drains. And so it was like, oh my gosh, I'm really just treating chronic inflammation. And then you look around you at all these other conditions like heart disease and diabetes and obesity and even depression. And you start looking at all the literature and it's like, wait, these all seem to have this element of chronic inflammation. What is going on? And there was this real wake up call for me. This is now 9 years into medical school and training where I'm like, I am learning so much about inflammation. I am treating inflammation constantly, but never once, not once in all of this time has anyone stopped and said, what is causing this inflammation? Why? What is inflammation? It's an entire system of the body getting revved up to fight a threat. It's there to fight something. And I don't know if this was your experience as well, Anthony, but like we were not taught to step back and say, like, what is that threat? You just sort of assume the inflammation just exists and we have to do something about it. And so that really starting to ask why with that question was really interesting because a lot of people will trace that conversation back to things like, oh, like our food is inflammatory and we've got toxins in our environment and we're not sleeping enough. And this is all inflammatory. And that is true. All of that is true, but there's actually a deeper layer to it, which is what led me to being really a metabolic evangelist, which is that then you have to ask like, well, why is the toxin inflammatory? And a lot of the ways in which like food and toxins and sleep deprivation and stress, a lot of the ways they actually promote this chronic inflammation is that they are hurting our metabolic processes. So they are either acting as direct mitochondrial disruptors or they're impacting the microbiome in a way that hurts our metabolic processes. And what you end up with through a lot of these different pathways is a cell that's not producing energy properly. It's not producing cellular energy, ATP properly. And if you think about it, what could be more stressful to a cell than not having enough power to do its job? So a cell that's not able to produce ATP in the amount that it actually needs to do its work is going to send out profound alarm signals to recruit the immune system. And then what happens is the immune system is at the ready. It's like, oh my gosh, we've got all these sort of ailing cells that are not powered properly, but they can't actually help because the problem is inside the cell. It's being caused by environmental factors that are disturbing an intercellular process that's leading to an underpowered cell. And the immune system can do nothing to help that. If it was a bacteria causing the problem, of course they could help then, but it's not. It's something much bigger than what the immune system can actually help with. They don't have arms to basically pull the donut out of your hand and, and throw it away. They don't have the ability to go outside your body and throw away the laundry detergent that's filled with synthetic chemicals that are going to disrupt your mitochondrial function. And so what happens is they keep working, they keep releasing these chemical mediators, these cytokines, creating this complete war and fire inside your body that's really doing nothing to help you because it's not doing anything to actually stop the problem that's causing the metabolic dysfunction. So it was a journey of figuring out, okay, chronic inflammation, start asking why, which we just don't do in medicine, being led to a bunch of environmental factors, and then asking why again. It's not just those. What are those doing to the cells? And then realizing a lot of it has to do with how they're actually impacting our ability to make energy. So now we've got these bodies that, again, they're underpowered, and you've kind of got this crisis going on in the average American body, which is revving up the whole immune system constantly until those conditions change. And then, of course, when you change the conditions, you improve the metabolic health. And these symptoms, as I'm sure you've seen in practice, a lot of them just like melt away. And it seems miraculous, but the biology, it all makes a lot of sense. And I think unfortunately the average doctor isn't thinking this way. And so a big mission of mine is like, this is not that complicated. I think everyone can understand this. And when you just understand some of these basic principles, I think it really gets people motivated to make some of these long-term consistent lifestyle changes. Because if you're asking people to make all these changes and they don't understand why, it's very hard. But if you kind of get like what dominoes you're trying to get fall, I think it's much easier. So, kind of making everyone well versed in the basic science of metabolism, I think, is a key step that I'm grateful for podcasts like yours that are helping people gain some awareness.
Oh, thanks. Well, yeah, I totally agree. That's very interesting too. Just the idea that the disruption in our energy mechanics in our cell can precipitate an inflammatory response. And I hadn't actually heard that before. That's very interesting. And it makes sense, right? And so, what is driving this inflammation? What is, obviously, we can get into, why, insulin is a problem, having chronically elevated insulin, and that is an issue, which is obviously why you want to, cover or use a CGM and see exactly what your blood sugar is doing and what your insulin is doing as a response to that. But, that is interesting. So at the moment, you say you in a functional medicine practice now, are you treating metabolic health, or are you mostly focused on the Levels company?
Yeah. So after I left the surgical world, which was 2018, I did start a functional medicine private practice. I went back and I got training with Institute for Functional Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And that was so invigorating because that was, it was like this light bulb went off of like, oh, this is the medicine I went into medical school to practice. I was so disillusioned, and I went back and got some of this additional training. And it just was like, yes, this is how I want to help patients. And I did that for a little less than a year, opened up a practice up in Portland, Oregon. And it was wonderful. And of course, the results were groundbreaking. Things I'd never seen in my ENT practice were happening routinely in my functional medicine practice, like people actually like really, really getting better with this high touch care. But then I think just having a little bit of like an entrepreneurial mindset, I thought, how can we take some of these principles and actually scale them? How do we, I can't spend 2 hours with every patient, like, and have the impact I want to have. I think with that, even though each individual interaction is so meaningful, but like there were principles that were kind of applying to everyone that was interesting to think about, like, how do you do a one-to-many sort of version of that? And that's what really kind of landed me towards more health technology. So how do we use maybe devices and software to get these principles out, and kind of let people use health technology to almost be a coach for themselves, and kind of be that little bit of that functional medicine spirit on their shoulder saying like, yeah, do this, do that. And kind of a lot of the things I was saying to my patients in the practice, but through a more digital first technology.
Yeah. That's literally why I started the podcast, was because I was having the same conversation with people, and I was like, I just need to have a video for this so people I can just, hey, just watch the video, please. And then you'll understand what's going on here. That definitely makes sense. And it is scalable, and it's great that you can put that in people's hands so they don't need to come see me or you or another practitioner and just sort of get that information face to face. They can just do it at home, and just giving people the ability to track their metabolic health, I think, is really, really good. So, could you go into some of the reasons and the benefits of using a CGM and tracking blood sugar for people at home, and why that is it's a major part of the Levels program?
Absolutely. So I think that at the highest level, the human body functions better when glucose is in a healthy and more stable range. When there is high glycemic variability, meaning that glucose in the bloodstream is swinging up, down, up, down, up, down in big peaks and valleys, that is not good for biology. That is going to not only make us feel crummy day to day, but it's going to set us up for those longer term metabolic problems and the development of more dysfunctional cellular physiology. So both in the short term and the long term, keeping glucose in a healthy range and less frequent erratic swings, less glycemic variability is good for health. So that's kind of a key premise. The simplest way to think about this is, everyone's probably experienced like a post-meal crash where they eat a big meal. And then a couple hours later, or even maybe an hour later, they want to take a nap. They might want another snack. They just kind of feel tired. And that's often correlated with a big glucose peak and then a crash afterwards of the glucose, which is actually, there's a term for that, which is called reactive hypoglycemia. So your body has a big influx of sugar or glucose, which can be from refined carbohydrates or refined sugar, which of course are making up the vast majority of American calories today. And, the glucose swings up, the body releases a ton of the hormone insulin, which helps the body take the blood sugar, the sugar out of the bloodstream into the cells. And then the body kind of overshoots and swings really low. And that reactive hypoglycemia is often when people feel that post-meal slump. That period has been associated with anxiety, with fatigue, with brain fog, and actually is when people often have carbohydrate cravings. And the reason for that is because when the glucose goes low after a spike, the body really wants to get it back up to its baseline. So there's going to be this sort of psychological drive actually to eat carbohydrates when you have the dip. So there was a paper published in Nature actually last year that was about how the magnitude of these post-meal reactive hypoglycemia dips actually were predictive of how much people would eat in a 24-hour period and how much carbohydrates they would consume essentially at the next meal. So you can imagine if you can level that out a little bit, go from peaks and valleys to more gentle rolling hills, you're going to avoid that reactive hypoglycemia that's quite unpleasant. Secondarily, we know that glycemic variability, so big swings in glucose or persistently high glucose levels, high blood sugar levels, these are associated with all sorts of problems for our biology. One is that high blood sugar levels is going to cause sugar to stick to things in the body. Like if you just imagine a bloodstream full of glucose, it's almost like it will just bind to things all throughout the bloodstream, even in the cells. And this is a process called glycation. Glycation is essentially glucose sticking to things. And of course, when there's a higher concentration, this is just going to happen more. And when glucose sticks to things, when glycation happens, it creates dysfunctional, proteins, fats, blood vessel linings, anything it sticks to generally creates dysfunction or an inflammatory response. You don't want sugar sticking to things. So glycation is one problem. The second problem is that it does generate inflammation. So high glucose levels creates a pro-inflammatory state, and we don't want that chronic inflammation because there's a lot of collateral damage when your immune systems are all revved up, sort of seeping out all their inflammatory mediators, revving up the sort of defense system of the body. And the third thing is that it generates reactive oxygen species. So these molecules, these metabolic molecules in the body that have unpaired electrons that basically go around trying to bind that electron. That electron that's unpaired is quite reactive. And so it tries to bind with things throughout the body to neutralize it. And that generates oxidative stress and essentially just sort of reactive, problematic biology. And so you get glycation, inflammation, and reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress, plus you get this reactive hypoglycemia. And all of this is why we want to keep our glucose more stable. So that leads us to tracking glucose. So if you have a little monitor on your body, a continuous glucose monitor that's like basically showing you these glucose trends 24 hours a day, like a little movie, and sending that to your smartphone, you can start to see patterns of what you're eating, how it's affecting that glycemic variability, those spikes and crashes, how lifestyle factors like exercising or walking or meditating, or sleeping more or less, how those things are mitigating that glucose response. Because it's not just the food you eat that impacts the amount of glucose in the bloodstream. It's all these other things too, like how much you're soaking up from the bloodstream into the muscles. And if you're sleep deprived, it's actually going to tell your body to keep more sugar in the bloodstream. And if you're stressed, the same thing happens. And with certain workouts that are actually more intense, like a powerlifting workout or a high intensity interval training class, your body actually might release glucose from the liver to fuel the workout, like a really intense workout. So you might see glucose go up when that happens. And that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. It's a little bit of a different process, but there's all these different things affecting what your blood sugar is at any given time. And by wearing a monitor like this, even for a short period of time, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, you can start to really intuit what patterns of eating and living are associated with that more stable, gentle rolling hill physiology that we want to see in terms of glucose, and start to make some smarter choices. So we see a lot of people who have been kind of trying all these different dietary philosophies for years, dealing with the reality of the situation as it's been forever, which is that we have very little feedback in terms of how these choices we're making are affecting us. Like we might look at the scale the next day, we might get cholesterol panel 3 months down the road, but it's very hard to know how all these different micro choices we're making every day are affecting our health and our goals. And the beauty of a sensor like this is it really tightens up that feedback loop. It's instant biofeedback with this biomarker that's quite important, so that you can really kind of cut through a lot of that mystery and kind of just cognitive load of thinking about what's working, what's not, and get a little bit more clarity on which choices are having the best impact on your metabolism.
Yeah, well, that's great. And so leading into the problems of these metabolic issues and hyperinsulinemia and things like that, I've heard you talk about how things like erectile dysfunction and PCOS are majorly driven by the sort of metabolic dysfunction. Could you talk a bit about those and maybe some other choice metabolic issues that people can reverse, focusing on these sorts of tactics?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think probably worth talking a little bit about insulin and how that relates to all of this. Glucose and insulin, of course, go hand in hand. When the body is trying to get glucose out of the bloodstream into the cells to convert it to energy, the body releases insulin from the pancreas, which essentially binds to the cell membrane and brings those glucose channels to the cell membrane so that the glucose can flow from the bloodstream into the cell. And ideally, once in the cell, that glucose would be broken down, taken up by the mitochondria, and ATP would be the result of that. And so that's when things are kind of working properly. And theoretically, you'd want to have a pretty good balance between the glucose that's coming into the body through food and the amount of ATP the body sort of needs, and things would run smoothly. Unfortunately, with what's happening today, we're eating, some people say 50 to 100 times more sugar. I mean, there's so many different numbers being thrown around here, but a lot more sugar than our body really was ever evolved to handle. So you've got this huge excess of this substrate for metabolism coming in. So from the standpoint of a cell, the body's like, okay, I need to produce a lot more insulin to get all of this glucose into the cell. And then the mitochondria is like, oh my God, I have to process all this glucose to energy, but it actually can't. And on top of that, the mitochondria is being damaged by all these other lifestyle factors, the chronic stress and cortisol, the environment, the 80,000 synthetic environmental toxins in our food, water, air, personal care products, by the sleep deprivation, which also leads to high stress hormones, which hurt our mitochondria. There's all these things kind of damaging this machine that's converting glucose to energy, and you've got way too much glucose coming in. So the body's releasing all this insulin to get the glucose in. The mitochondria can't really process it. So what happens? the mitochondria actually blocks that glucose from being converted to ATP because it can't handle all of it. And a lot of that gets turned to toxic fats that sit inside the cell. So you get these ceramides and diacylglycerols, DAGs, and things like that. And you get this cell that's basically filled with essentially toxic fat, which actually blocks the insulin signal from being transmitted from the cell membrane into the cell. And so you get this really dysfunctional biology where too much glucose, mitochondria is dysfunctional, cell fills with fat, blocks insulin signaling. This is now insulin resistant. So now the body's producing all this excess insulin to try to get the glucose into the cell, but the cell's blocking it. The cell's like, nope, can't do it. So now you get more and more and more insulin being generated. And that insulin essentially is going to build up in the bloodstream, just like the glucose is building up in the bloodstream, and cause lots of problems in its own right, including impairing the nitric oxide pathway in our body, which is, of course, what dilates blood vessels. And so one issue that you start to see here is issues with sort of vascular flow, which leads back to what you were talking about with erectile dysfunction. Because erectile dysfunction is essentially like the blood vessels in the penis can't dilate fully, so you can't get an erection. And so Viagra actually increases nitric oxide function in the penis. But if you trace it all the way back to how this relates to metabolic dysfunction, we're really talking about an insulin issue, and coupling that with excess blood sugar in the bloodstream, which of course is causing glycation, which further damages the lining of the blood vessels. So it's just this like crazy perfect storm that is all linked back to just inundating our bodies with way too much of the substrate that the cell needs to process, and damaging the mitochondria through all these other environmental factors that we've talked about. So we want to keep insulin low, and we want to keep glucose in a healthy range. When it comes to infertility, the leading cause of female infertility in the United States is polycystic ovarian syndrome. And various different studies talk about different rates of this, but somewhere in the like 12 to 25% of women globally of childbearing age are dealing with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is fundamentally a metabolic condition. And what happens in this high insulin state, like we were just talking about, is that insulin actually, one of the other effects it has on the body is it stimulates ovarian theca cells to produce too much testosterone. So now you've got women having their ovaries stimulated by insulin to make testosterone. And that really perturbs the delicate balance of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, which have to basically be in like perfect harmony for normal ovulation, menstruation, all these things. And so insulin is essentially driving a different sex hormone milieu in the female body, which leads to not only the infertility, but also many of the other symptoms that women often see with PCOS, like excess hair growth and acne and other things that are driven by excess male hormones in the female body. So that's sort of just some of the, sexual health side of things. And there's a lot of other things actually going on in that realm as well. Like, we know now that actually, aside from erectile dysfunction, which is affecting a huge percentage of men over the age of 40, even younger than 40, but the rates are very, very high. Sperm count is also down 50% since the 1970s. I don't know if you've seen some of this data, but it's wild. If you just basically look at sperm under the microscope from the average American man, it's down 50% on average. And a lot of this has to do with metabolic issues as well, in part because it comes back to testosterone again. You need the right balance of testosterone and other sex hormones to produce sperm. And in men, the visceral fat around the belly, the fat that is associated with metabolic dysfunction, this is fat that actually, interestingly, acts as a hormone converter, and it converts testosterone to estrogen. So Dr. Ben Bickman, amazing metabolic researcher, says that the fat around a man's belly is basically acting like an ovary, like it's basically creating estrogen. And this then is decreasing the ability of men to create healthy sperm. And so that's just kind of focusing on the sexual health side of things. But it's all intermingled with the metabolic conversation, and has not yet quite permeated the subspecialties in a way that we're actually practicing in a metabolically focused way. So we still hit men with Viagra. We're hitting women with, birth control pills to manage their hormones. We're now focusing on things like semaglutide and Ozempic for the fat, but none of it's really getting to that root cause.
Yeah, absolutely. That was in my functional medicine practice, the practice that I joined. That was one of the first things that he talks to his patients about when he counsels them, is that he sort of plays a quiz, what is the largest endocrine organ, and no one gets it, but he says it's the fat. Your fat is your largest endocrine organ, especially when we're quite overweight and have a lot of excess fat tissue that, as you say, creates, generates estrogen. And it's basically our largest endocrine organ. So he really focuses on that. Said, hey, we need to correct this, and that will also correct your hormones as well. And that's something that I didn't get taught in medical school. I don't know if they mentioned that to you, but that was news to me.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's definitely not mentioned in medical school. And, it's interesting. You talk to I have a lot of friends who are OBGYNs, and one of the key medications that's used in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome is metformin, which is a diabetes medication. And yet when you talk to doctors about, hey, have you ever thought about prescribing like a continuous glucose monitor to your patient with PCOS? It's like, no, of course not. Like that would be great. And it's interesting. It's just, even though CGM is a tool for managing diabetes, there's some missing link because you're in the specialty of, okay, well, this medication is standard of care for our patients because they are dealing with insulin resistance, but going a step further and prescribing a tool to, empower them to sort of change their diet is still not common practice for sure. So yeah, but the trends are definitely, I think, favorable. I think there's a lot more doctors who are aware of metabolic health than there were a few years ago. So that's definitely heartening, but it's still more the functional medicine community for sure.
Yeah. Well, it seems like fertile ground though, right? Because they're saying that this is, well, we understand this is insulin resistance and we prescribe metformin, like very easy, short step to say, well, maybe this is a consequence of metabolic dysfunction and pre-diabetes or diabetes that we're just not really diagnosing as such. And then so treating it in the same fashion would probably make sense.
Yeah. And also 50% of women with PCOS will develop type 2 diabetes before they're 40. So it's like, it's just the opportunity for prevention is so high because so many of these women, it's basically like a big warning sign of, it might be their first sign of metabolic dysfunction, but in a way it's like a gift. It's like, okay, you are heading down this road. So before you move into full blown type 2 diabetes, like get on top of this, but just prescribing that woman, oral hormones, maybe a low dose metformin, that's not going to be enough to stave off, a metabolic issue down the road. So I think people really learning, okay, this is the moment to put in some really intensive dietary and lifestyle strategies. And there's been amazing research that's come out in the PCOS world about how even short-term dietary interventions can be incredibly effective in reversing PCOS. There was a study, I'm just making sure I get the details here, but they put, it was 2020 and they put a group of women with PCOS on a ketogenic Mediterranean diet. So it was basically like healthy protein, unlimited leafy greens, and that was pretty much it. It was like protein and like unlimited vegetables, essentially low glycemic vegetables. And they did it for just 12 weeks. And they also gave them a polyphenol supplement. So like some plant, healthful plant chemicals. And the women lost on average 20 pounds in 12 weeks being on this low glycemic Mediterranean diet. And they had statistically significantly lower levels of insulin resistance, triglycerides, total cholesterol, LDL, and their reproductive hormone levels normalized in 12 weeks. So, it's so hopeful. It's like, dietary interventions, that's going to not only set that woman up for better chances of fertility, but also like just longevity. So really some great hopeful data in that area about the impact of diet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've certainly noticed that the reactive hypoglycemia that you mentioned. I mean, I don't eat anything really except just meat, but even just milk, right? Like I'll have a glass of milk and I feel fine, and then an hour later I'm like passing out on the couch in the middle of the day. So I mean, I tend to avoid milk just for that reason. And I actually did an experiment where I drank quite a lot. I drank like a gallon of milk a day for 3 days. And even just then I checked my bloods and I checked my insulin. My fasting insulin was elevated the next day. So it actually had a big impact on me already, and it normalized subsequently within a few days. But it was interesting that just milk could do that as well. And so even people in like just a sort of an animal-based meat-only diet, they still have to watch out for those sorts of things. Like these carbohydrates, if they raise your blood sugar enough, they will raise your insulin, and doing that long term can damage you.
Yeah. That's amazing. Are you just going into a lab and getting like a blood draw insulin when you do an experiment like this? Is it? It's probably easier to access in Australia. It's still, there's a barrier to doing it in the US, unfortunately, which is you like. And I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but you need the physician prescription for the test and all of this stuff. But we're certainly hoping for improved access to insulin monitoring over time. Cause like you said, it's, I would say, in addition to glucose, it's one of the most important tests we can know about our own bodies. And I would just say for anyone listening, like that is not a standard ordered test. It's not something that in the US doctors are going to order on a yearly physical, but it probably is the most important blood test that I think people can get is a fasting insulin, because even if your blood sugar is falling if the fasting blood sugar is falling in a fairly normal range, without knowing the fasting insulin, you actually don't really know how hard the body is working to keep the blood sugar in that range. So you can imagine someone who's early insulin resistance and their body is pumping out more insulin to drive blood sugar into the cells. They might have a quote unquote normal fasting glucose level, like 85 milligrams per deciliter, but one person might have a fasting glucose of 85 milligrams per deciliter and their insulin is like 2 or 3, very low. The body's not working very hard to keep that blood sugar at that level. And they're clearly very insulin sensitive. But the person with the same fasting glucose and an insulin of 20, that's a sign that person might be early insulin or developing pretty significant insulin resistance, and their body's actually pumping out so much more insulin to keep the blood sugar at that level. So, I think that certainly for anyone listening, that's a test to really push your doctor to order for you at the same time as a fasting glucose, so you can really understand level of insulin resistance, which, my hope is that in a few years, every American is going to be well-versed in understanding whether they are insulin resistant or not, because that is information that is truly can be life-saving. And these tests are not very expensive. They just, there needs to be willingness of a doctor to order them. And one of the things we're actually doing at Levels to solve that issue is we're now offering, in addition to the continuous glucose monitor, we're also offering a 5 biomarker blood panel that you can order through Levels very seamlessly, and basically walk into a lab, get these 5 blood biomarkers done for $149 anytime you want, and be able to keep track of things like fasting insulin. Just because there's still quite a bit of pushback in the US for primary care doctors ordering that, perplexingly. And so we're trying to make that much, much easier to access for people at a affordable price with, easy logistics.
Yeah, that is one of the easier things about Australia is I can just prescribe myself medications or blood tests. I just walk in and be like, yep, I want these. And they're like, okay. And so I just decided one day, I'm just gonna get my bloods run. And so I just, filled out my own portions and I mean, that's the thing too, is that I see people I'm sure you see a lot of this, is that people have completely normal blood sugar. They'll have normal HbA1c or even low HbA1c, but you check their fasting insulin and it's elevated. It's markedly elevated. And so and from what I understand, you can have insulin resistance or elevated insulin, but normal blood sugar for a decade or more.
That's right.
Before you start having dysfunction of your pre-diabetes and your blood sugar starts going up. But I would sort of think, if we're, depending on how we define our terms, if type 2 diabetes, the hallmark is insulin resistance, that's really the start of diabetes, is when you start having to overly compensate with this insulin resistance, and your insulin levels are very up. Your body's compensating, you're able to handle it. So your body, it's not fulminant diabetes, it's not fulminant insulin resistance. However, it's there. And as you say, if we're only chasing our tails and going to when it's completely off the rails and someone has full blown diabetes, you've missed the boat. You've missed the opportunity to address this and stop this from being a problem in the first place, right? And this is like, it's the difference between telling someone to wear a helmet and doing a craniectomy to remove a subdural after they smash their head in, right? I mean, so like you can stop this before it starts, right?
Yeah. I think that's such a good point. I mean, this is why it just drives us crazy that prediabetes is called pre-anything, right? Because prediabetes is essentially advanced insulin resistance. Once your blood sugar is starting to creep up into the non quote unquote normal range, that insulin resistance may have been there, like you said, for 10 years or more. And there was this paper from the Lancet a few years ago that showed this, that basically showed that if you actually are checking markers of insulin resistance, which is that early sign that the cells are blocking the entry of glucose into the cell, likely because there's toxic fat inside the cell because of downstream or upstream mitochondrial dysfunction and this problem converting glucose to energy. The cell then is protecting itself basically by becoming insulin resistant. And then that's triggering the pancreas to release more insulin. So once that insulin number starts going up, just keep that visual in mind. It's like there's a lot of crap happening in our cells for that response to happen in the pancreas. And that is happening in, I would guess, there's not research on this, but I would guess that is in the vast majority of American bodies at this point, because there's just, so many people with metabolic dysfunction. And if 50% of Americans, which is the statistic now, are pre-diabetic or have type 2 diabetes, and that is happening 10 years down the road after insulin resistance starts, how big is that number if you actually had all comers with insulin resistance? So
absolutely,
there's not an optimal range right now for what optimal insulin levels are, that has been defined by any governing body like the International Diabetes Federation or the ADA. They don't even talk about what normal ranges are for that. We have surveyed our group of medical advisors for levels, who are some of the, leading metabolic health researchers in the world. People like Dr. Robert Lustig, Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. David Perlmutter, Dom D'Agostino, Ben Bickman, Terry Walls, Sarah Gottfried, David Sinclair from Harvard. So we routinely ask them, based on your expert opinion and your review of the literature, what do you think is optimal? And when we talk to our advisors about insulin, really the range that we kind of came back with the synthesized expert opinion is 2 to 6 milliIUs per milliliter. So pretty tight, pretty low. Some advisors said less than 10, less than 8, but 2 to 6 seem to be probably where optimal is. If you look at the lab sheet that you get back from a lab in the US, they will typically say less than 25 is normal. And so you really have to think about, first of all, what's optimal and what's normal. And then what's just a lab basically saying, oh, this is 2 standard deviations from the mean of everyone who comes in here. Well, you don't want to be the mean or within a couple of standard deviations of that from the average American. So 2 to 6 is certainly where I try and land. I don't know if the units are the same in Australia, but I'd be curious if there's a particular range that you've kind of landed on in your clinical experience.
So the ranges that we tend to use are, remember offhand, it's either, I think it's 4 to 7 or 4 to 9. Yeah. Anyway, in that range, so very, very close. Yeah. And those are the ones we use. Mine like 3.5. Yeah. So
mine's 3.8. Yeah.
Yeah. And
at least last time. Yeah. And I think ideally everyone in the world you know, should be able to rattle off like, what is your fasting insulin? What is your most recent fasting glucose? What is your most recent fasting triglycerides? Probably also their CRP, an inflammatory marker. Like if you can do that and they're all pretty optimal, like you are so far ahead in terms of the whole like longevity, reverse, prevention of chronic disease realm. But we need to, I think if you went to a dinner party and went around the table and asked everyone to do that, I think probably 0.00001% of people could do that right now. Maybe they're fasting glucose, but certainly not the others. So if you're listening to this, get those tests and make sure you know them, because it's gonna help you live a much happier, healthier life if you can get those in range.
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised if anyone who was non-diabetic, even knew their fasting glucose. I mean, there'd be a few people in this realm that would check that sort of thing, but I think from the normal person, it's really like you don't track that unless you have a dysfunction, and you're sort of forced to track it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that brings us to, well, okay, we have this sort of marker of metabolic dysfunction people can track and say, okay, my insulin is a bit up, blood sugar is fine now, or maybe I'm sort of pre-diabetic, or in advanced diabetes is really what it is. What do people do at home? What are some of the interventions that people can do to improve their functionality at home?
It's a great question. And actually, just one other thing that you just said that I reminded me of something else that might be worth mentioning is that, we were talking about this like window between when people might have normal-ish fasting glucose, but high insulin levels. And there's this window before they might know they have a problem. One interesting thing about wearing a continuous glucose monitor is that there can be some signals of insulin resistance or like brewing metabolic problems that you might see on a glucose curve that you would not necessarily see just by having your fasting glucose. And a couple of those, like one is general glycemic variability, like how spiky are you? There was an interesting paper out of Stanford, Michael Schneider's lab a few years ago that was all about glucotypes. And he basically put continuous glucose monitors on lots of healthy and pre-diabetic people and looked at their patterns and showed that there's sort of low, intermediate, and high spikiness of a 24-hour glucose curve. And the more spiky someone gets, more glycemic variability, that glucotype of more severe variability was associated with those higher fasting insulin levels, higher triglycerides. That's basically a sign that you're kind of moving in that bad metabolic direction. So spikiness is one. The second is actually like how long it takes you to come down after a meal. So if you're dealing with someone who's pretty insulin sensitive, even if they eat a big high carb meal, like for me, it would be like a huge handful of grapes. Those are just like, they crush me. I might go up 100 milligrams per deciliter with a big handful of grapes, just wild. You want it might go up really far, but it should come down really fast, because that's a sign that your cells are hearing that insulin signal, pulling it out of the bloodstream, and that's all working properly. But you can imagine if someone's kind of moving down that spectrum of metabolic problems and they're a little bit insulin resistant, they're not going to clear that glucose as fast. So they might actually have a wider spike, and it looks more like, instead of like a sharp up and down, more of like a wide mountain, and maybe it would take 2-3 hours to come down all the way. So that's kind of another clue, is like how wide are the spikes. So that's kind of an interesting one. And just sort of other little things you can look at from that 24-hour curve that you'd never be able to get from a one-time measurement. But in terms of things that people can do, I have to say the basic one, and the one that I would say is like foundational to above all others, is to focus on food first and to move away from all ultra processed foods like that. If there's, of all the things I know and have learned over the years, it's like, if people could move away from the ultra processed foods. So essentially the refined processed sugars, the refined processed grains, and the refined industrial seed oils, and just eliminated those from the diet and moved towards more real food that's minimally or unprocessed. I mean, that's number one. And it doesn't even really matter in my mind what the pattern is, whether it's carnivore or vegan or whatever. If you move in that direction towards eliminating the ultra processed foods, you're going to be doing better. And the reason for that is in part because unprocessed foods are going to give your body a lot more of the good stuff that they need for the cells to work properly. The micronutrients, the antioxidants, the polyphenols, the protein, just the basic building blocks that the body needs to function properly. The second piece is actually has to do with the sort of monumental overloading of the body that we're doing right now with substrates, essentially through ultra processed diets. With real food, you cue the body's really exquisite satiety mechanisms to basically help you not want to overeat. When you eat real food of almost any kind, the body is fairly incapable of overeating because it is so well designed to essentially cue these hormonal satiety signals. It's when you start ultra processing food and just changing it and turning into this different thing that you just basically override the body's ability to signal when it's full or not. And this is why you don't see any obese animals, you virtually don't see any obese animals in the wild, because no matter what they're eating, there's plant-based animals, there's carnivore animals, there's omnivorous animals. They don't get obese generally because the body knows how to self-regulate, but only if it's eating minimally or unprocessed food. So, that to me is number one. And when people start moving towards a more whole foods diet, they tend to, see their glucose numbers do a lot better. But then there's a lot of refining that can be really, really interesting. And one that a lot of people notice is that is just like the impact of balancing their meals properly. So people really learn quickly wearing a continuous glucose monitor how making sure that there's adequate protein, healthy fat, and fiber in meals. And we might feel differently about fiber, and that's totally fine. Yeah. But just in terms of if someone's spiking on a food that they love, if they can add in more protein, fat, or fiber, they will often see a big diminishment of that spike because of the way it's slowing digestion. The fiber may even be blocking glucose absorption from ever even getting into the bloodstream. And it also cues increased satiety. So they might actually eat less of the carbohydrates. People also find that food sequencing the meals a little bit differently can help. So actually, if you're going to be having sort of like a meal with all different macronutrients, eat the fat and protein earlier in the meal, eat the carbohydrates last. And that seems to also change the glucose response. So let's say you had a plate that was like a salad and then steak and then potatoes. What the research shows and what we also see in our data set is that if you start with like the steak and eat that first and actually give it a second to sort of digest and then maybe eat the salad, so starting to get a little more carbs and then eat the potatoes at the end, it would be a much different glucose response than if you ate the potatoes and then the salad and the steak. So that's kind of like a freebie, just like eat the meal in a different sequence. And then another like really simple tactic that I would say most people wearing a CGM end up employing pretty regularly is taking just a brief walk after a meal. We see in almost 30% on average decrease in peak glucose response if people just take a simple, gentle walk after a meal. And the reason for this is because the muscle is a massive glucose sink. It's when you activate the big muscle groups, which you're doing by taking a simple, gentle walk, that is just pulling in tons of glucose from the bloodstream. So there's almost nothing more exciting when you put on a continuous glucose monitor than after a meal where you start to see your glucose going up, just immediately throw your tennis shoes on and take a 20-minute walk and just see it come right down. So that's really, really motivating. And I would say speaks to a broader point, which is that one of the things that I think the glucose monitors really engender is the value of actually moving more throughout the day in a low grade way. Like it's not like you need to be exercising all day, but kind of moving away from this paradigm of like, oh, I'm just going to exercise for 45 minutes and that's my physical activity for the day versus can you maybe walk a little bit, every hour throughout the day, even if it's 1 to 2 minutes. Just get up, walk around, move around a little bit, keep the muscles active, because then you're kind of creating a situation in the body where you're keeping your glucose channels at the cell membrane like all day. You're keeping those GLUT4 channels at the cell membrane all throughout the day, kind of keeping the muscles taking up glucose. And that can have a really big impact on 24-hour kind of average glucose levels. So get up, do a few air squats, take a 1 to 2 minute walk. It just sort of constitutively keeps the glucose moving out of the bloodstream. Mm-hmm. In contrast, if you're someone who's sitting most of the day and then has their 45-minute or an hour workout in the evening, that's great. Or in the morning, that's great because you're getting some exercise. But it's a totally different physiology from that person moving a little bit every hour throughout the day, because the times that you're sitting for 3 or 4 hour periods, you're basically not activating your glucose channels to come to the cell membrane. And so you're keeping more of that glucose in the bloodstream. So big takeaway for sure from our population and from the research is try to do like a little bit of low grade movement every half hour throughout the waking day, and you'll see generally much lower glucose patterns.
Okay. That's interesting, actually. I remember hearing about a study when they were looking at indigenous populations, sort of hunter-gatherer sort of things. And they were thinking, it's like, okay, are they more active, or are they standing, walking, moving? And they found that they were fairly sedentary. They were sitting on average similar amounts of time as people in the West would, except that they were getting up about every 15 minutes. So they weren't just sitting down for 5 hours in a row. They were sitting down for 15, 20 minutes. They were getting up, they were doing something, they were sitting down again. And at least that researcher, I forget his name, but he's at Harvard. And he thought that was a major driver for their good health, or at least one of them anyway. And just that getting up and moving throughout the day.
It's so interesting. It is that. I do think that probably is it, because there's been research that's sort of repeated this in the US literature. And there was one that was super, super interesting. It was a study where they basically took 3 groups of people, and what they did was they had people, so people were either doing a discrete 30-minute exercise period once per day, or walking 1 minute and 40 seconds every 30 minutes during waking hours. And so basically both groups walked for 30 minutes total per day, but one was split up into just like you're saying with this indigenous tribe, like a minute or two, like up and down, every 30 minutes, and vastly lower 24-hour glucose levels in the group that did the every 30 minutes. And so, theoretically they could have been, and in that study, they were sitting the whole rest of the time, but just that like popping up and getting those muscles to essentially be metabolically active and keeping that engine running throughout the whole day created a totally different situation in the body for metabolism. So that's an easy one to implement. Free, easy, not hard, and I would say definitely a big takeaway from what we've seen in our data set.
Yeah, great. I would say, with the fiber, I totally think that fiber is a good idea, depending on what you're eating too, because, like exactly as you say, and as I've seen Dr. Lustig say, when you're eating whole fiber, it makes a lattice and it blocks out about 30% of your absorption. So if you're eating a lot of carbs, you're just blocking out 30% of the carbs you're eating. So that makes perfect sense why studies would say that this helps with blood sugar control. Like I don't doubt it. It's like you're not eating 30% of the carbs that you're eating.
Freebie.
Yeah, exactly.
We love freebies. Yeah.
And so if you're eating things that you don't actually want to absorb, eat it with fiber. Great idea. I don't think I need it for me because I don't think I'm eating anything that I don't want. And so I want to absorb all that sort of stuff. But I do think in those circumstances, it would be a good idea. And so, we talked about exercise and we talked about diet. What about things like sleep and stress? How do they affect metabolic health?
Yeah. I think sleep is one of the most under-recognized factors of our chronic disease epidemic, of any of them. I think we're starting to talk about it more. Thank God for Matt Walker, Andrew Huberman, and, the 8 Sleep people, a lot of cool sleep technology coming out. You've got Aura and Whoop, like people are starting to get it. But I think one one key takeaway, I just finished a book on metabolic health that's coming out next year. But I think one of the things that I was so struck by sort of like reviewing all the literature was that it's not just sleep quantity that is really impactful for metabolic health. It's actually sleep quantity, it's sleep quality, and it's sleep consistency. So quantity is basically the total number of hours that you're sleeping. And the literature shows that actually it's 7 to 8 hours time asleep that appears to be best for overall metabolic health. And it's actually a J-shaped curve. So meaning that below 7 to 8 hours, the risk of metabolic diseases go up sharply. But actually over 8 hours, and it also goes up, which is sort of hard to totally understand, but basically there's a sweet spot. And when the body is deprived of sleep quantity, it's certainly a stress signal on the body, and those catecholamine hormones and the cortisol and the inflammatory mediators get released, and that's all a problem for metabolic health. So I'm a big fan of the sleep wearables and the trackers, because I think it's really easy to think that you're getting enough sleep, and actually you're somewhere between 30 minutes or an hour less than what you think you got. Getting into bed at midnight and getting up at 7 is not 7 hours of sleep, right? There's time that we're awake during the night. There's time to fall asleep. There's all these different things. And so we really want to see 7, 8 hours time asleep on a tracker, and make sure you're logging that day after day, week after week, for optimal metabolic health. The quality has to do with, how much of the different sleep stages you're getting. Are you getting enough REM and deep sleep and restorative sleep and all these different patterns of sleep? And that has a lot to do with the sleep environment and what you're doing before bed. So eating late at night, drinking alcohol anytime close to bedtime, or really anytime at all, and having any light on in the bedroom can all have impacts on quality of sleep in huge ways. Even having the light from like an alarm clock can have an impact on our sleep. So you really want the room to be pitch dark. You want it to be silent. You ideally, don't want to have any alcohol on board, and try to space out food at least a couple hours from bedtime. That can all have a positive impact on sleep quality. And then consistency also has an impact on metabolic health. And that is basically, are your bedtimes and awake times pretty consistent day to day? And so it's like, are you going to bed at 11 p.m., sometime between 11 and 12 p.m. every night, and getting up between 7 and 8 a.m. every morning? If that's sort of like your schedule, that's fine. And it seems to matter more that you're consistent than exactly what those bedtimes are. Like, it's not necessarily that 10 to 6 is better than 12 to 8. It's actually probably just as important or more that you're being consistent day to day and getting the good quantity and quality. So that's certainly I would say, of my wellness journey personally, that's the one that's hardest for me. I mean, you're in the medical field too, but you know how it is like during training, and I don't know how it is in Australia, but like that was actually impossible during a lot of training because of on-call nights. And I mean, I felt the toll. Like my metabolic health went off the rails. And when you screw up something as primordial as sleep, the body does not like it. And that comes down to a lot of our circadian pathways. The sleep consistency, we have these genes in our bodies that are like the clock genes, and genes that are controlled by our central clock in the brain. And they're on these 24-hour schedules, but they're not perfect. And one of the ways that we entrain the clock in the body, reinforce its 24-hour signal, is by when we go to bed and when we wake up, when we eat our meals during the day, and when we see light during the day. Those are 3 of the main ways that we reinforce the circadian clock. And so eating regular meal times, getting sunlight first thing in the morning and not too much late at night, and having consistent bedtimes are 3 of the key factors we can do to reinforce our circadian rhythms. And that is monumental, because so many of our genetic pathways that are related to metabolism, like literally when genes are turned on and off, are downstream of the circadian sort of central clock. And so you want to do what you can to entrain it. And of course, in our modern lives, where we're like erratic sleep, light 24 hours a day, light all the TVs on in the background, we're sleeping, and then eating meals just kind of whenever. Can you imagine how confusing that is for our circadian genes and our central clock? Like, it's just,
Absolutely.
I can't imagine how confused it is. And so, of course, we're getting this whole, metabolic disaster because our bodies are just so confused. So a lot of what I think about is like, how do you actually create this environment through our choices for the body to just actually make it understand what time it is? Like, it doesn't have a clock inside. Like, it doesn't have a watch to check. You need to give it signals to let it know what time it is. And one of those things you can do is go to bed at a set bedtime, which I struggle with still, but it's one that I'm working on. So that's kind of the sleep picture, and happy to talk a little about stress as well. But if there's any follow-ups on the sleep stuff, I'd be happy to talk more about that.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's really important. It's interesting about the J-shaped curve where, it can be a problem afterwards. I wonder if that's a product of physically sleeping too long, or because you're so metabolically unwell and your body's requiring you to sleep more. And that is a consequence of just being unwell, something like that. Is there any evidence to one direction or another?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but that is a really interesting hypothesis of like, if the body is sort of in a almost like a state of needing increased recovery because it's sort of got problems for whatever reason, maybe that's why people are sleeping longer, and that could have to do with the J-shaped curve. That's very interesting. Yeah. Or dealing with something like depression or other conditions that kind of lead to hypersomnolence or whatnot. So very, very interesting. Yeah. I don't think that's known.
Yeah. It's, it's interesting that it happens at all. You would think more sleep, better. And I do remember one study that was very interesting with mice, and they just looked at the impacts of losing REM sleep. And so they tracked them, and as soon as they went to sleep and went into the REM pattern, they just sort of woke them up, gently, just woke them up, and they get sort of agitated and then go back to sleep. But they would never let them stay in REM pattern for very long, and just wake them up immediately. And so after a few days, they were just like, a bit more tired and agitated, and they were getting a bit more erratic. And they did this for a couple of weeks, and they got more and more erratic. And then after 2 weeks, they all died. And and that was but they were getting the same length of sleep overall. They just weren't getting REM sleep. And so, it was very interesting how much of an impact that has on our brain and metabolic health.
Yeah. That's wild. I mean, they just dropped it. Yeah. That reminds me of one other study that I is fascinating. I think was worth sharing, which is that you can actually take a group of humans, and I don't think they could do a study like this anymore, but they did it back in the day, and they took 11 young, healthy men, and they basically took them and gave them 6 nights of sleep deprivation. And it was not all nighter sleep deprivation. They basically just limited them to 4 hours of sleep, which honestly, like, probably some college kids are doing that, like young, healthy person, 6 nights of sleep where they only slept for 4 hours. I probably did this during exams or finals. What happens when you do that? You basically turn them all into pre-diabetics, over the course of 6 days. And so you end up inducing impaired glucose tolerance, and they actually were 40% slower after day 6 of clearing glucose out of their bloodstream. So they'd give them like a glucose load, like an oral glucose tolerance test, and it was 40% slower getting it out of their bloodstream, which is essentially a sign of pretty severe insulin resistance because the body's not able to clear the blood sugar into the cells. So then they followed it up with 7 nights of 12 hours of sleep. So basically as much as they had 12 hours they could sleep. I don't think they probably all slept 12 hours, but they could sleep as long as they wanted, essentially. And things normalized. But it's profound. And for me, it's very motivating that like, if you can induce insulin resistance in your body just by not sleeping, even if you're eating the perfect diet, and doing all the other things, if you're not sleeping, you're inducing insulin resistance. And so it's very motivating to me personally, that, these are levers that we can all pull, for our metabolic health. And if you skimp, maybe it's not 4 hours a night, but skimp to 5.5 or 6 hours for over the course of days, weeks, years, like that's going to have a huge impact. And the average American on average is sleeping 6.8 hours per day now. And this has decreased from over like a little bit over 8 hours a century ago. So sleep is going down. And I think there's no question this is absolutely going hand in hand with our chronic disease epidemic. So
yeah, absolutely. Who is the gentleman from Berkeley, the sleep specialist? God, maybe mention him, but he said that, in his book, he said that if you average less than 6 hours of sleep a night, you're 6 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. So, I mean, that's clearly showing metabolic dysfunction from lack of sleep.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Is this Matt Walker, maybe?
It must be. Yeah.
Yeah. Why We Sleep is such an incredible book. I recommend that to everyone. Really the science of sleep, and definitely makes you think that the healthcare system needs to reform, because it's a lot of the studies where they're showing the detrimental impact of sleep deprivation is in residents, like medical trainees who are basically, end up having micro sleeps as they're working, because they fall asleep for little momentary periods because they're so tired, and they get into more car accidents and create medical errors, and all these things are happening. So aside from the metabolic issues, of course, there's just a huge cognitive, load. And not to mention, when you are sleep deprived, your body is so much more motivated to eat carbohydrates. That's a very well-known phenomenon. And so we see a lot on the continuous glucose monitor data. We hear this a lot from our members of like, if they, took a flight that caused them to be up all night or whatever, like often the baseline glucose will just like jump up 10 points, like it frame shifts up basically. And that's one thing that's really interesting to see on the CGM is like, we think that kind of like we have some set level of metabolic health or like insulin sensitivity. That's sort of like where we are right now at this point in our lives. But the reality is it's bouncing around like all the time. And so that's actually helpful to see, is like, you could make yourself pre-diabetic. Either of us could in a week if we wanted to, and then get back on track. And this has actually happened to me before. Like I like my fasting glucose to sit between like 75 and 80 most of the time. But like, if I am totally off the wagon, like I'm traveling, I'm eating a little bit of airport food. I mean, things that I don't try and do often, but like not exercising, not lifting weights, not sleeping well, I'm stressed, whatever, I can easily get up to 100 fasting glucose. I can get back down very quickly. But if you can see how that's happening, you can just imagine how, if you weren't aware, you could slide down that slope and just kind of keep moving into that territory until it's sort of more firmly solidified in your body. So, and that's another really interesting thing about monitoring. And you could even do this with a finger prick glucometer if you don't have a CGM, is like realizing how dynamic the body is in both the wrong direction, but also in the right direction. If you kind of dial in the habits, I think it's very motivating. So sleep is definitely a factor in that though, for sure.
Yeah. That reminds me back when I was doing, one of my sub-Is at Duke, I was in plastics and reconstructive surgeon. I was getting maybe 3-4 hours of sleep a night. We were, in the door at 4:30 in the morning, and we'd be operating till 9-10 at night easily every night. Oof. And sometimes, 2 in the morning, and then back in at 4:30 sort of thing. And so that was a lot. And then I just sleep for 16 hours on the weekend. Like as soon as I just be in a coma. And I remember that phenomenon of just like, I need carbs. I wasn't doing carnivore at the time, but I was always very meat based. And so every morning when I went in, I'm like, okay, I need to go to the commissary, and I would just get, a bunch of carbs and like a big soda with a bunch of sugar and caffeine. Like, I need this to survive. And I absolutely felt that Then my intern year was the first year I ever started drinking coffee because I was just like doing 105 to 120 hours a week. And not fun, not pleasant work. And I was just not happy, and I was just felt miserable and just tired all the time. And just, if I was home, I was sleeping. That's what it was. I didn't have a life that year. And, contrast that with now, where I'm arguably doing more hours because I can do it just as much at work. But then I have my functional medicine clinic on the weekends that I'm not working at the hospital, and I'm doing podcast stuff on the evenings and weekends that I have free time. So basically every waking hour of every day, I'm doing this. It's much more, it's not fun not sleeping. It's not fun working all night and then all the next day and then late until the evening, or 48 hours over the weekend and then having to do a 14-hour shift on Monday. That's not fun, but I can handle it now. And I'm not completely stressed out and freaking out and just going like, I'm just going to kill myself. My intern year was the longest year of my life. That took forever to get through. And now it's been like 4.5 years. I'm like, really? Is it really? That's crazy. It's just flown by. So I don't think I'd be able to do that. I would not have been able to do that if it wasn't for my diet and being more healthy overall. But if I had other pieces of puzzle out of place, it would all fall apart for me.
Totally. Yeah. Bringing back memories. But yeah, no, my health went just totally off the perfect health in medical school, just like thriving, everything was great. And then surgical residency started, and I got, IBS, and I was, low energy, acne, chronic pain in my neck. I was getting anxious, all this stuff. And it was like, the second I don't know if you had this in your residency, but it's like, I had like a research block for 6 months where it was like out of the hospital and just like a 9 to 5 in a lab. And I was eating normally again and seeing sunlight and sleeping regularly. And like everything went away in like 6 weeks, it was just back to normal, everything. And that really was definitely laid the groundwork for me pursuing the functional medicine path after I left surgery, because I realized it's all the conditions. This is not, you could easily imagine if you didn't see such a stark, like on off switch of health like that, like where it was like, I'm healthy and then I'm not, and then I'm healthy again. You could think like, oh, this is just who I am. I'm just someone with acne. I'm just someone with moodiness. I'm just someone with gut problems. But it's like, no, like this was an on off switch because of these 5 or 6 things that were happening in my environment, chronic stress, not sleeping, being on call all the time, just like the cafeteria food, all that stuff. And then the carbs, of course, because, you're just ravenous. And so that it's just, when you experience that much of a stark contrast, it's like, oh, this is conditional. This is the environment. This is not me. But I think when some patients have been living this way for so long and they've never seen the other side of it, like, oh, this is not my baseline. This is the conditions. And then if you can pull them out of it so that they can start to see how good you can feel, it's hard to go back, So I think a big part of, I think putting people sometimes on like a really strict couple of weeks of a diet, like a Whole30 or something like that, or probably for you putting people on a carnivore diet or something like that. It's like, you can so rapidly get people to start to feel a little bit better, maybe for the first time. And then it's kind of like a glimmer of hope that you can then work towards growing that.
Yeah, definitely. And so, well, you mentioned it as well, stress being a major driving factor. Obviously that has hormonal components as well and can derange our metabolism. Can you touch on the importance of stress and stress management?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a lot of different research that's kind of touched at this, ranging from, chronic low-grade stressors like work stress being associated with development of type 2 diabetes or metabolic dysfunction, also childhood trauma. So there's the ACEs score, which is adverse childhood events. And an average childhood event would be something like losing a parent early, or a divorce, or being abused, or a number of other different things. And basically, the more of these experiences that a child has had, the more likely they are to develop a metabolic issue down the road. And so there's certainly this epidemiologic data that shows that an adult being under stress, a person who dealt with stress in their childhood, this all pushes people towards more of a chronic disease profile. And then the reason it's probably happening on a biologic level is it's a couple things. I mean, stress impacts our microbiome. It changes our gut function and our diversity of microbiome, which of course the gut-brain axis is so linked. It impacts our HPA axis. So the sort of like this master stress system in our body, from the hypothalamus, pituitary to adrenals, that produce this whole series of hormones that control our stress response. Early childhood trauma can just kind of impact that in a profound way over the long term, and sort of change our stress threshold, and make our bodies kind of a hyper vigilant state, and keep us in a bit more of like a chronic hormonal stress state through cortisol and other catecholamine hormones. And these hormones have an impact on both our liver and our liver's production of glucose, and also our mitochondrial function and our inflammatory system. So in the way that it affects the liver, cortisol and other stress hormones actually tell the liver to break down stored glucose and release into the bloodstream. And so we store glucose, of course, in chains called glycogen in the liver. And that's basically like this debit account of energy in the body, where like if your body thinks that you need energy really quickly, it'll dump some glucose from the liver into the bloodstream to sort of fuel the rest of the body. And in a real stress situation, like you need to run from a threat, this would be useful, because if you're fasted and you really need some quick energy for your muscle, sure, if your liver dumps a little bit of glucose and it can fuel the muscles and the brain, that's great. But in our current life, we don't need to really run from anything. We're just sort of stressed because of these more emotional issues that we're dealing with, and sort of like more psychological stressors, the emails and the honking and the text messages and the news cycle and all these things. And so what's happening is the body's still responding by dumping glucose into the bloodstream, but our body's not actually using it. It's not fueling the muscles because we're not going anywhere. We're sitting at our computers. So you end up basically just like chronically dumping glucose into the bloodstream, and it's essentially sitting there. That's a problem. So that's one way. The second piece is that that stress is going to rev up our immune system and our chronic inflammation. And that's, like we talked about earlier, sort of just basically intermingled with the whole metabolic dysfunction sort of pathway. They're kind of the yin yang of metabolic disease, is sort of the mitochondrial function and metabolic side, and the chronic inflammation side. And together they just create the perfect storm of dysfunction in the body. And so, yeah, so a big thing that we see in our population of people wearing continuous glucose monitors is actually that they find that wearing the glucose monitor is almost like a mindfulness biofeedback tool in some ways, because they'll find that things that they didn't totally realize maybe were stressing them out, like maybe they have to talk in front of their company or go on a podcast or something like that, they might find that their glucose rises during that. And that is probably a sign that something's happening, where stress hormones triggered the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream. And that's a great signal, basically showing you, okay, my body was feeling stress in some way. People sometimes find when they fight with a spouse, like have an argument, their glucose will go up or something like that. And so what that then could cue is that people need to develop the toolbox of stress mitigation strategies to hopefully just essentially create a situation in the body where it feels safe. So that might be, working on the diaphragmatic breathing or the box breathing, or, keeping a gratitude journal, whatever modality is helpful for like acutely creating a sense of safety in the body in the moment. That would be a good sort of tool to employ in that moment, because day after day, if this is happening over and over and over again, it's of course going to create compounding problems. So, so stress has a really interesting relationship with blood sugar. And And I think the modern world we're living in, we're dealing with a lot of these chronic low grade stressors that are probably different from what our ancestors dealt with, which was more like intense acute stressors that resolved and went away. But day to day, they weren't happening kind of all the time in this little sort of like nagging way that has a uniquely problematic impact on our metabolic pathways.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, that's all excellent. And I think that's given a lot of people a lot of tools to improve their metabolic health, whether they go on a carnivore diet or anything else. And it's not like, as you say, it's not just diet. It's a major, major factor, but there's so many other things that go in. So thank you very much for sharing all that and sharing your time with us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's so great to connect. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So where can people find you and follow you?
So the best place I would say to find more information about like anything that we talked about today is levelshealth.com/blog. We have an amazing editorial operation at the company that really strives to be the best resource for comprehensive metabolic health information on the web. And so that's levelshealth.com/blog. We put a lot of sort of derivative education from that on social media. So at Levels on Instagram and Twitter. And you shared the giveaway link in the beginning. So that's a great opportunity for people to try continuous glucose monitoring if they want, which I believe was levels.link/the plant-free MD giveaway. And our newsletter is amazing. Tons and tons of education, a lot of practical stuff about food, what to buy it when you're at Costco or Trader Joe's or Whole Foods that's going to be metabolically healthy. So I'm personally at Dr. Casey's Kitchen on Instagram and Twitter. And but most of my articles come out through the Levels content. So yeah, those are the best places to find me.
Perfect. Well, I'll put those all up in the description and people can find you there. So Dr. Means, it's been it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Hey guys, thank you very much for taking the time out to listen to what I had to say. If you like it, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast. And if you're on YouTube, then please hit that little bell and subscribe, and that'll let you know anytime I have a new video out, which should be every week, if not more. And if you could share this with your friends, that would help me get the word out and let me know that you like what I'm doing. Thanks again, guys. To show is that meat is bad. You shouldn't eat meat. You should eat fruits and vegetables. When you say when you eat more fruits and vegetables, people automatically think you're eating that instead of meat. Right? That's not the case. You're eating it instead of processed garbage. And if you're eating it instead of meat, you will have poor health outcomes just like the akikuyu.